right, welcome to another edition, another episode of New Wine Table Talks live on Facebook. Hopefully everyone is coming off a wonderful time of giving thanks and Thanksgiving. And as we're pushing forward, we're continuing our series on setting the spiritual clock, or at least using the book that we spoke about a couple weeks ago, Setting the Spiritual Clock by our very own Dr. Paul Louis Metzger down there. You see, we've got him sort of stowed away on the bottom, keep him out of trouble. But we're stoked to continue this conversation, setting the spiritual clock and kind of writing our perspective. And New Wine, the push for New Wine is to build relational bridges in contemporary culture through Jesus Christ. And so we would like to continue to invite you into this movement, and especially coming to the end of 2020, we're excited for what the Lord has in store and what is going on in the midst, even in the midst of COVID-19 and the social unrest. There are ways for us to see the good of being human and the good of our role here on God's stage and the world stage. And so that's what New Wine's push is. And so we're asking you to join us. We've got opportunities. If you just right now, before you leave Facebook, go on right up to the upper right-hand corner and hit like. And that way you like the Facebook New Wine page, so that anytime that we put information on there and ways in which you can participate with what New Wine's doing. Though there's a lot of local things in the Portland area, we are nationally expanded, and we have places. So maybe in your local area, you're thinking, hey, how can New Wine step in and participate here? Reach out. Go to new-wineskins.org, our website, and it has an opportunity for you to sign up for a newsletter and become part of this movement. And then that way we can participate with you wherever you're at in your local context as well. And so we're excited for you to be joining us here on Facebook. Also, go on over to our YouTube page and hit subscribe there, YouTube.com/New Wine, New Wineskins. And that way you can be updated on any of the other former further episodes that we've done, whether it's on Facebook Live. We have New Wine Tastings where Dr. Metzger sits down with others and has interviews and goes through. We have series on the social injustice, the racial tensions that we have. We have stuff on COVID-19. We also have another program called New Wine Uncorked, where we sit down with pastors and local leaders, and how is it that we can engage culture through the lens of building relational bridges. And today we're continuing that movement. And so today our talk is Advent. Jesus is coming. The question is, are we waiting for him? And so we're stoked for you to be joining us on Facebook Live, as well as our distinguished guest here with us today. So welcome. Paul?
Thank you, Matt. And thanks to everyone who's joining us live here at Facebook for New Wine Table Talks. It's something that started many, many years ago, and then it's gone on and off. And then Dr. Harper and I were doing them on campus during the lunch break, during campus lunch breaks, during the noon hour. And then with COVID, we decided, hey, let's go and do it on Facebook Live. So that's what we're doing. And that gives us flexibility to have others join us, friends in different regions of the country. And today we have Jimmy Calhoun down in Austin, Texas. Heather Timmons, who's in Southern Oregon. Again, where exactly, Heather?
I'm in Ashland.
Near Ashland, that's right. Dr. Harper from his home in Vancouver, Washington. Jim Sequeira in Vancouver, Washington. Trudy Sang over in the west suburbs. Matt down in Folsom Prison, California, and I'm here in my office in hell. So anyway, so thank you for joining us for New Wine Table Talks Live. Today, the theme we're dealing with is Advent. Jesus is coming. Are we waiting for him? Advent is about Jesus is coming, and we're going to deal with both his first and second coming. We feel so much distress and we're under duress in our society. That goes without saying. I think we all experience it in one way or another. And we're always looking for hope. Unless we're moving toward nihilism, we're looking to find hope. Question is, where are we finding it? And for us as Christians, as much as we need to be in the world, we also need to make sure we're not of it. So we need to engage our secular age, what Charles Taylor wrote about, secular age. We need to be sensitive and discerning and engaging well in our secular age. we don't want to be parochial in the sense of just being myopic and just being to ourselves as Christians in a holy huddle. But we also need to make sure that the Christian calendar, which reflects the Christian stories, it revolves or rotates around Jesus's life, is not eclipsed by the secular calendar. And while the secular calendar starts up in the West, at least in our context, January 1st, the Christian year starts at the beginning of Advent. And this year was November 29th, last Sunday. And the opening theme often for many churches that honor Advent is this theme of prophecy, the prophecy candle some churches will highlight. And they'll light the candle of Advent for the prophecy, the Old Testament prophets, the prophets of the Hebrew scriptures, looking forward to that messianic hope. And that is what we account for with the first week of Advent. And today we're wanting to deal with that theme of hope, looking at this last Sunday, Advent. Jesus is coming, because that's what Advent's about. Jesus is coming, first coming and second coming. So my question to my guests, my colleagues here is, how does the theme of Jesus' first and second coming shape our hopes and aspirations in the present season of life? Let's start with Brad, and then we'll go from there. Brad, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that when you ask the question, you're not just saying the second coming, because that one's kind of the obvious one, but really his first coming. And, much of my education, as you know, Paul, comes from Roman Catholic institutions. I did my doctoral work at a Jesuit university. One of the things I really appreciate about my Catholic education in theology is that one of the main lenses through which Catholics look at theology and do theology is the incarnation. Always thinking through the human Jesus, the suffering Jesus, the incarnate Jesus, much more really than thinking about, the glorified, exalted Jesus. When the monks and nuns of the Middle Ages would think about serving community, the mystics would think about serving. Each day they would meditate on Jesus. They always meditated on the crucified Christ, not the resurrected Christ. And when I think about his first coming and the incarnation and looking at hope through the incarnation, I really think about God deciding to bring hope to us in our present circumstances without changing them. Hope for humans is often about, I need my circumstances to be changed. I'm suffering. This isn't good. Prayer for evangelical Christians is often about, dear God, would you please change my circumstances? The reality is, when he comes the first time to bring us the hope of the Messiah, he doesn't change the circumstances. He instead enters into them, and he suffers with us, and he partners with us. And so the hope of the incarnation is the hope about God's presence in the midst of suffering without changing our circumstances. And as I'm moving into my mid 60s, age-wise, and I've been a Christian all my life, I realized that God's practice has been not to change my circumstances. Sometimes, but very rarely. And so if I'm going to find hope, if it's not going to be some kind of escapist hope, it has to be a hope in the presence of God in the midst of my suffering. And that's the hope that I get from the incarnation. Of course, the hope of the second advent, the second coming, is that God will change our circumstances. He will make things the way they're supposed to be. But what I love about at least my own theology of the second coming is that the second coming isn't about God coming to earth and taking us away from the world. It's about once again coming to the world, making it the way it's supposed to be, and then allowing us to continue on with him in a very earthy existence. When you look at Revelation chapter 21 and 22, it's heaven comes down to earth. It's not us escaping here. It's about the princes of each culture coming with the joys and the treasures of their own ethnic cultures, their own tribal cultures, and bringing those things to praise God and to worship the Lamb on the earth in this situation, not escaping it, but allowing his presence to make it what it's supposed to be. So I think that's how the Advents speak theologically about hope to me.
Thank you, Brad. lot of profound thoughts there. And even when we think about eschatology, the study of the future, as we often think of it, and we've been a part of Jesus's eschatological kingdom community since his incarnation. I mean, the church is that. Uh, it tends to be often escapist in American evangelical circles, just like you said about take away my problems or change my circumstances. We just long to get away from this world rather than somehow, as you've articulated in many contexts, Brad, how to live in light of Jesus' future kingdom coming now, how to bring the future into the present, and also with it, how do we live now in light of his first coming, the incarnation? And so past, present, and future all intersect in one another, with one another in a beautiful way in the New Testament reality. And actually the whole of the Hebrew scriptures all the way through to the apostolic witness of the New Testament. So I want to thank you, Brad, for those comments. Jim, you're part of a storied community in your Indigenous culture as Native Hawaiian. You often speak to this. And, even though it's a bit off script, I just wanted to ask, as you think through story and Christian story, always being a part of a story community, whether it's Native Hawaiian or in this context, the Christian story, how does that story shape your experience this Advent season as a pastor leading a church? How is that in this season with hope, aspiration, bound up with our being part of Jesus's family story from his first coming to his second coming? Jim?
Oh, great. You're making me follow Brad. How come I couldn't follow you? That would have been a whole lot easier.
Well, let me just say this. It was hard because Brad wasn't mentioning what was really going on. When he said, God changed my circumstances, what he was really saying is, God, would you please take Paul out of my life? And he learned God wasn't going to do that. And so, I know what's really going behind the scenes. And now he's kind of drawing you in his universe. Just when I thought I was getting out, they keep pulling me back in. Michael Corleone. So anyway, Jim, your thoughts?
That was weak. So, I think for me, the bigger picture of Advent, it's about the season and what Advent is for me. And when we look at the church calendar, like Lent and all those other things, but specifically Advent, it's a season of preparation. And so, for Indigenous people, land is very important. We're tied with the land, but when we see the various seasons, especially living in the, in the Northwest, we see these various seasons, but these seasons remind us to, it's time to plant, it's time to harvest. It's, so there's these seasons. And so for me as an Indigenous person, the beauty of the Advent, the calendar, is that it's a reminder, it's a season. And so this season is a time of preparation, preparing our hearts for Christmas and that season. And so, but for, indigenously, what I think, what I'm learning about hope is that it requires a lot of imagination. God has used an incredible amount of imagination when we talk about situations and when we look at stories unfolding. The imagination and what we imagine and what the Creator imagines is far, far different. And so for me, it's like, it's hope. It's, the hope, I think the hope maybe during the Assyrian occupation for Isaiah, the hope was, hey, send us a warrior that's stronger than the Assyrians. But what does Isaiah say? Hey, you know what? I'm sending a child. A child will be born to you. I mean, that takes a lot of imagination to say God's going to send a child. And so for me, hope is being able to recognize God's imagination. When he's, and that first Advent, that preparation, and even everything that leads up to it, there's a lot of imagination. It's not the way we would have done it. And then even now, when Jesus shows up, he's not a warrior king. I mean, he's a carpenter's son. And that takes a lot of imagination, but through God's imagination, I think that's the beauty of it. And I think for me as an Indigenous person, we have a lot of stories. And the Christian church would say our stories are superstitions, right? But there are stories. I mean, they teach about creation. They teach of the Creator, being present. And so, I mean, in a way, if we were just to look at some of the stories, scripturally, I mean, some people might think, well, that's kind of superstitious, isn't it? I mean, a talking donkey, but that's the beauty of God's creation. That's the beauty of God's imagination. So for me, when I think of hope, and what speaks into my life are these crazy imaginative stories that come to life. And I think like Brad was saying, it's not about our circumstances, and it's not even using our own imagination, because I can tell you what I would like to see hope being, but God has a far more better, imagination. He has a better, I don't want to say plan, but his imagination of what he can accomplish is far better than what I can imagine. And so for me, it's the mystery, right? It's the imagination is the mystery of God and being able to live in that mystery. And so that's that connection for me. It reminds me of my heritage, that mystery, and that God does work in mystery. He doesn't just lay things out and say, well, this is the way we're going to do it.
Thank you, Jim. And I love how you articulated that with the creativity, the matter again of your stories woven in with God's story in terms of your culture. It's not to be displaced or demeaned, but to be celebrated. Indigenous cultural heritage and stories bound up with God's ultimate story. And Heather, you work as a pastoral leader with children. Children have hopes and aspirations, right? And it's not just for what they'll find under the Christmas tree, Christmas morning, but I can only imagine what it must be like for you in your pastoral work, working with children during this particular tumultuous season, having no doubt many of them having to work at home, study at home, and the like. What are some of the hopes and aspirations that you find them articulating, and how is it that this Advent season bears upon that in your own context with the children?
That's a great question. The part that Dr. Harper said that really stood out to me is that God offers hope without changing our circumstances. And I think that it just flies in the face of the prosperity gospel, or if I follow Jesus, I have a happy, easy life. And so when I think about even the children that I work with, they're feeling the weight of what's going on in our communities, what's going on in our world, the lack of being able to go to school. And I think one of the things we can offer children is the truth, which is that Jesus is with you even when it's hard. You're never alone. So it may be very, very hard, and we can't deny that, and we shouldn't deny that, because kids will see right through that, right? If they feel pain inside their heart, just like we all do, someone can tell you you're fine, but they know if it doesn't feel fine. And so giving them that context that even when it doesn't feel fine, even when it's scary, even when they don't get to see maybe grandparents, or they have concerns, that Jesus is with you and walking with you through this time. And that, man, I just love what you brought up about imagination, that we can imagine what God has for us and what he's going to do. And so I think that really, children are wired towards imaginative thinking. And so to really play into that about taking the gospel and looking at it through the different facets. I think of it like a diamond, and there's different facets, and we can look at it from different angles and see what is God doing? What has he done in the past? What might he do in the future? So.
Yeah, thank you. It was interesting as you were talking about imagination and children. Think of Chronicles of Narnia, right? It's all about Aslan coming with the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Yesterday in theology class at Multnomah University, I was with college students, and I brought up C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia, and it was just striking how the students, it was a theology class, students just, their interest is peaked. And it was actually Voyage of the Dawn Treader with Eustace that we got into, but their interest was peaked. And they know that story. They know the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But C.S. Lewis writes children's stories. This great scholar writes these children's stories, and they come alive to people, right? And even these children, it's only as children that they can go into Narnia. Once Peter and Susan get to a certain age, they can't go in. They have childlike faith. And I think that's what Lewis is trying to get at. And Advent hopefully rekindles in us childlike faith. I want to go to another question. I want to ask Jimmy this to start off, and then Trudy and Matt. Jimmy, how does the theme of Jesus is coming lead us to wait with expectation and action rather than escapism in the here and now. You and I have known each other for a long time, for many, many years. And, you know, I read your books, I've endorsed, I've written, just in great support of your incredible work, Jimmy, as a pastor, as an author, as a musician. You're also someone who's very embedded in engaging the story in your work as a pastor, as a musician, with race. And the African-American Christian community has always been at the forefront of thinking through Jesus' coming. I think his first coming, his second coming. And this theme of Jesus' coming not leading us toward escapism, even in songs like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, I don't look at that as an escapist song. When slaves and others would sing songs like that, it was to give them hope in the present where there wasn't hope to be found. How does Jesus' coming, first and second coming, help us, in your estimation, move us from escapism to action, to activism, to expectation in the ultimate sense of agency here and now? You're on mute, Pastor.
There we go. I had actually been thinking about, as everyone was talking about, childlike faith and expectations, and I thought, well, there's a little bit of a difference in the way I perceive expectation, and one of which is like sometimes you want to throw off hoping too broadly, hoping too big, because you know those are impossibilities. I grew up in a neighborhood where if anyone went to college, it was very, very rare. And if anyone aspired to beyond working at the local plant, I mean, I talked to one of my high school friends the other day, and he was so happy. He was bragging, "Oh, Jimmy, I got a job as a manager. They elevated me to manager." And then another guy, you remember old Johnny over there? He was a manager too, and that was as far as we could see. And so therefore, it's a little bit of a difference. And so I would say in our community, the hope that's in Jesus would be different possibilities to consider, not to glom onto and just take for granted out of a plethora of options, but really to see to be aware of possibilities out there, because they're really hard to see sometimes. And even when they're presented to you, there's this automatic pushback. Oh, that's not for me. That's not for me. That's for those other folks. It's just kind of, it comes second nature sometimes. So.
Jimmy, if I hear you correctly, can you hear me now? Sorry about the muting.
Yeah.
If I hear you correctly, you're saying to even have a sense that there are possibilities is something to inspire in people and to invite people to consider, right? Is that part of it, what you're saying?
Well, yeah, that's part of it, but just the perception. The other day I heard somebody talking about the church is in a post-theological age. And they weren't talking about that we don't study what people in the past have said about God, and that we don't have great authors and great scholars. They were talking about people that attend church don't think very deeply about who God is, and they don't have their own formed opinion or shaped opinion about who God is besides what God does. And having the first coming, thinking about, what does it say about God to come in the form of a baby? You know, he could have just shown up all of a sudden at 28 and nobody would have known he wasn't around all the time. He just came on the scene and said, well, I'm here. I'm getting ready to do some stuff. Come on and watch me. But God decided to come in the form of a little baby with all that entails, all the formative years and all the messiness that comes, all the insecurity. So it seems that there's more to it than just Jesus has come to model or to, like you said, escape, to do something, to bring me out of something, but to show me what God's really like, and that there's no circumstance that God's not in. That by God coming and starting from the very beginning, he's going to go through the whole ball of wax, just like I'm going to go through, and that includes everybody. So it's just considering possibility. There's more coming, and there's more available. I don't know if that was clear.
No, and I love that. I think even as a jazz musician, which you are, isn't jazz about discovering new possibilities, even in each song? And some of us here on this line love Stevie Ray Vaughan's music, and he was there in Austin, Texas, if I'm not mistaken, way back when. His brother said Jimmy never played the same song once. There were always infinite possibilities with Jimmy's music, or with Stevie Ray Vaughan's music. And so I think you even probably pastor as a jazz musician, always inviting people to consider new possibilities.
Well, jazz is confusing, so I've done plenty of that.
Well, Trudy, you work extensively in the disability community. You're a leader. You're a president, Trudy, of a nonprofit, working as or chair of a board, I think it is, with a nonprofit, interfaith nonprofit.
Correct.
As we're here, Trudy, at the Advent season, this theme of hope and aspiration, not escapism, how does that inform your work and inform the disability community, even in your interfaith work, people that you're working with?
Well, good afternoon. I was just reflecting on so much of what we would normally do, or how we would frame everything, has just been blown up. And so even what was traditional, or what we would normally present or discuss, is having to be reframed. And so in our case, we've had to find those new pathways of connection, and yet not let the restrictions consume us to hopelessness, but to move us towards hope. And so, like, even in our sermon series at our church, it's focused on Hope is Born. We're doing engagements with the community, and some of our individuals that are connected in our disability community is partaking of that. It's called Boxes of Hope, which is coming alongside the families at risk in the local school. And it's cool to see some of our individuals that have a diagnosed disability be partakers of being involved in that. So it's that purpose, that connection. The one example is just how we've tried to also put things into people's hands from a distance. And so, like, for example, for kids, as well as we're going to do with our some of our special needs population, is we have like a bag of Advent devotions that are hands-on, visual, to kind of bring the aspect of the Advent season to the forefront. And they get to do this at home, and it guides the families or the individuals or the connections to be able to still have some sense of hope and connection, even though we're at a distance. And so I think that's where the struggle is because a lot of our special need individuals have vulnerable, their own medical concerns are vulnerable. And so it's trying to navigate those ways to make it connective. And Zoom is highly used, and being able to connect with some of our individuals, whether it's through Bible study or conversation or activities, but it's really making us have to push. And I think in some sense, it's making us really rethink what is really important. What's the elements that are really needing the attention, because we're having to filter it down to essentials that really mean something rather than just a bunch of fluff, or because it's taking too much work to get some of this done. And to do that, you really have to kind of simmer it down to make it be more intentional.
Yeah, it's really good, Trudy. And again, we're dealing with this theme of possibilities that Jimmy was riffing on, developing, and then you're adding to it, and then being resilient. I just think we can't say enough about the need for resilience. And I think Advent, if we're really taking Advent seriously, makes us resilient people. And, you know, Trudy, you're resilient. And the disability community, in my experience, people I know in the disability community are often very resilient. They've had to spend their whole lives figuring out how to make the best of what the rest of us would call less than ideal situations. And if you don't mind me saying, I think the world of your son, Luke, you know, just how he leads people in worship and such, even in the midst of being someone who has a disability, but I don't think he thinks of himself in that way. And, you know, there's a study on disability paradox that we often tend to kind of, in a sense, look down or feel sorry for people with disabilities, like they have a less than stellar quality of life. They don't see it that way. They often, according to this study, think that their quality of life is better than ours because they know how to emphasize what's essential, to your point, not what is unessential. And we have so much to learn from the disability community, rather than to feel sorry, but to really say, man, I feel sorry for myself after learning so much from them. We did a premiere documentary that you can find on our Facebook wall that Matt helped to edit on this subject of moving from isolation to inclusion. And we need people in the disability community to help us prioritize and where to find our hope in Christ this Advent season. Matt, you, of course, are much younger than I and still much wiser. And you are very well connected to even people much younger than you. It's something that you're really, I think, keen to engage as teenagers, young adults. You're just wired to engage in a variety of ways, including teenagers and the like. And what we see so many younger people concerned for is our broken world, and very passionate and concerned to engage a broken world. Brokenness is a key part of life, and they see it. They're honest about it. How does Advent speak into this with expectations and aspirations, not escapism? You know, Nine Inch Nails' song "Hurt," which I just love, especially Johnny Cash's rendition. Jesus doesn't avoid that. Back to Brad's point, he engages. How does that funnel and shape our aspirations, not in an escapist direction, but full engagement head on?
Yeah, in that song "Hurt," Trent Reznor originally sings, you know, I hurt myself today so I could see if I still feel, you know. And Advent is such a, this semester I dig teaching. I mean, I tell the students all the time, I like teaching in the fall because it leads into Christmas. I like teaching in spring because it leads into Easter, right? But the Advent, the coming of the King. And so in today, especially 2020, I know everyone's thinking, oh my gosh, 2021, January 1, all of a sudden it's going to be new year. It's all done. We're good, you know, and it's all in the background. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. And so in my classes and even my family here, we've been talking about my family specifically going back to our days when we were there at Multnomah working on a master's. Kristen and I, we would go to some of the seminars and together. And one of the things that came about was this idea of expectation and expectancy. See, when we go into situations with expectation, we're disappointed because we set up the parameters in which things must happen. So if Jesus enters in my life, I have expectations when I say yes to him, this is what's going to happen, you know, because all my pains and all those things that I want gone, they're going to be removed. My teeth get white, they're straightened without braces. The six pack that I've always wanted on my stomach is there finally. And I'm, the person I always wanted to be, right? Well, that's expectations. We become disappointed with that, especially when we go into situations. We look at today and we think, this is how I want it to happen come December. I'm going to do this, this, and this. I put expectations on there. When that doesn't happen, then I become disappointed. Jesus's coming is to say, have expectancy that God is present, that what's going to unfold is through the Spirit's leading, and it's going to blow us away in the sense of the creative, imaginative powers that will be unleashed will show us that when we say to love the other, it means creatively how to embrace the other in ways that we never thought were possible. And that's where I dig with what Jimmy was saying, is where you have these possibilities in front that might not always be attainable. You have the possibilities, and that's where faith steps in. The Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard said that faith is the absolute paradox. It's that stepping into the unknown with confidence of knowing that what I'm stepping into is the expectancy of God's presence. And I'm sitting back and waiting for him to lift me up and thrust me into the mix of reconciliation. And that's the excitement. And so I think that for us and for our family, and what I try to teach the kids is that's where the childlike faith comes in. Kids will pick up a toy that they've been playing with for months and decide to do something different with it. It might not be appropriate to stick it up their nose or in their ear, but they're investigating. They're like, look at this. This is something new. And they do it. And as parents or as adults, we're like, what are you doing? They're like, with childlike faith, I'm investigating this world that God has gifted us with and blessed us with. And so how is it that I'm stepping in and participating with? And I think as an adult, that's why I love hanging around with my niece and nephew, because 7 and 5, and I'm just like, I love them teaching me about life. We get down there and I'm like, I don't understand why you're doing this. What do you think so interesting about this? So Uncle Matt, this is why. And I'm like, oh, that makes me, and that's stepping into situations with expectancy. Because with a 7-year-old boy, I don't know how he's going to respond in a situation. And I'm always excited. I mean, I'm more excited now because it's not my child. So I'm like, oh, that's not my kid. That's her kid, But his expectancy, just the situation, he allows the situation to happen, and he participates within it. And I think that's what I've lost sometimes as I get older, as I try to control so much. And Advent is a reminder to me that, as we said, a baby born, not a 28-year-old dude, right? A baby in the midst of the donkey dew and all that stuff, and says, this is salvation. This is the reconciliation, the peace that you have. We should step back and go, what? And that's why I think sharing our faith makes only way that people can be drawn into this is that intimate personal relationship. Because if you tell them from a distance this story, it doesn't make sense. So I think that's why the expectancy of, I love getting up every day and say, okay, Jesus, blow my mind today as to how you're going to use me for the sake of your kingdom, for the sake of our kingdom. So I think that Advent is cool when we allow it to be the advent of the excitement and creation and the imaginative powers of the way God's going to use us and seeks to use us.
That's beautiful, Matt. Amen. And I love the distinction between expectation, the way you were framing it, and expectancy. And I think there's something for all of us to take from that. And we have great expectations that we impose on God, that we project onto God, rather than coming with a sense of expectancy. How is God going to show up? The way that God seeks to show up, in a way that I think is going to unravel our imaginations and reframe them and rebuild them. Transitioning here, Brad, a question for you, and then we'll build on your response. What happens when the Christian narrative, the biblical narrative, the ecclesial narrative of the church year, the church calendar, does not shape our calendar? I mean, we learn a lot of one another based on our checkbooks and our calendars, what fills them. But so what happens when the Christian story or Christian narrative does not shape our calendars on a daily, weekly basis on Outlook and elsewhere, and as it reflects on our hopes and aspirations? What happens in your estimation? And you're on mute.
I think what happens is we get co-opted by the cultural definition and struggle for hope, so that For those of us who are Americans, especially white Americans, we have this American dream mentality. He who dies with the most toys wins. There's this very consumerist sense of hope in American life. I'm fascinated that, in all that our country is going through right now, that has to do with things that really, really matter. Long-term things about relational realities and race and poverty and people being able to even work across the aisle with each other to do something that's good, and the inability of that happening, and just all the awful things going on. It almost seems like still the thing that excites us most is that the Dow Jones Industrial hit 30,000, and that still kind of looms out there as this consumerist sense of American hope. And I guess if you don't have the story of Jesus, the Advent story, the biblical narrative shaping what hope looks like to you and what it means to you, we're all cultural creatures. So we have very little alternative but to be shaped by the American consumerist economic I have lots of goods and a good life kind of reality for hope. And of course, the thing that is even more discouraging about that is, of course, for the most part, that kind of shallow understanding of hope, even as shallow as it is, that's even only available to the smallest percentage of people. It's largely available to white, wealthy, people who come from, privileged backgrounds. For much of the rest of America, that vision of hope isn't even available anyway. And yet we still become co-opted by it.
As you're saying that, Brad, it reminds me of something Gordon Bigelow said in a Harper's Magazine article back around 2004 or 5, I believe. And I reference it in this book, Setting the Spiritual Clock. He says that for evangelicals, he's talking about the evangelical story, the evangelical narrative, we're often shaped by way of free market economics, not just in terms of our market or our approach to economics, but as a way of life, as a way in which we read all of life. And he refers to it as the ultimate theodicy for a lot of evangelicals, how we deal with the problem of evil. And he said, it's not the biblical creation narrative for many evangelicals, and he's not an evangelical, he's analyzed it. It's not even the theory of evolution that shapes the psyche of even our society as a whole. He said it's the market narrative. And he said it's treated as if it's an artifact of nature, that this is just the way nature operates according to free market economics. And just to point further to that before I open it up to others, just as I'm struck by what you're saying, Michael Sandel, whose book I just love, he's a Harvard professor of public philosophy, where he talks about in his book, What Money Can't Buy, the Moral Limits of Markets. He says, I don't have a problem with the free market economy, but it's a free market society where the only thing that has value is what has a price tag. And when that happens to our psyche, when that shapes the church, rather than the story of Advent and this priceless babe in a manger, and what our friends at Advent Conspiracy and their work would do, it's not presence, TS, but presence, NCE, the presence of Christ. That's priceless, that's invaluable. And that's what Advent does for us, is it shapes that story, the story of our imaginations. So thank you, Brad. Other thoughts on that point that Brad was getting at? Anyone? I just want to open it up for one or two more, because we have another question I want to engage, but anyone who wants to address that issue, when the Christian story, the Christian calendar does not shape our imaginations, what happens to how we approach and perceive life?
I mean, I really appreciate what Brad said, because it is about story. I mean, it is about the Advent story. It's about, there was a day when the people were told that the Messiah was coming, and they anticipated and they waited, and they're kind of wondering if he'd show up, and he showed up, and he walked among us. But here's the cool part: he's coming back. You know, and I think the story is so important. And, you know, and sometimes as a pastor, I wrestle because, you know, we always want to try to do something new and, you know, and new ideas and all that. But, you know, I mean, I've come to the point where, you know me, the Advent story is the Advent story, and people just need to hear that story. But to Brad's point, I think it's so important to share the story of what Advent is, because I can see in a few years where, you know, you get a bunch of people together and they say, what does Advent mean to you? And they would say, oh man, I loved Advent. So I would get these Advent calendars, right? And I got a Hot Wheels Advent calendar. And you know what, today I looked, they have like they have rum booze Advent calendar. And so pretty soon our culture starts to dictate, hey, this is what Advent is. It's about getting this, you know, something to open for however many days, 24 days, and you get candy, you get a transformer. And so I think story, like Brad says, if we don't share the story, if we don't take the time and the responsibility, not only in the church, but to our family members and to those around us, our children, to share that story, somebody else is going to define that story. And so just, you know, as I was thinking about that and looking at some of these Advent calendars, you know, Brad nailed it. Our cultures, our society is going to define it for us. And they're going to do it in a way that they can profit from it.
So what I hear you saying, Jim, is we need to be alert. And as a pastor, no doubt you're seeking to help your congregation grow in alertness, because if we're not constantly going back to make sure we were being transformed by the renewing of our minds, other things will come in and conform us to the pattern of this world in terms of our imaginations.
You know, and not only as a pastor, but hopefully our people are willing to share the story too. I mean, that they're sharing the story at home. I mean, I think, you know, this Advent season is a wonderful opportunity because we're having people being able to share the story. So I think, you know, I mean, yeah, we have the responsibility to make sure we share the story, but we need to let people know, hey, you know what? It's not only my story, it's all of our stories. And you know, and you're responsible for sharing that story as well.
Thank you, Jim. And by the way, did you buy the Rum Calendar?
You know what? Yeah, it was really, really good. That's why I'm kind of a little like trying to stand up.
Yeah, you tell me when you're looking for those particular calendars. If you see one for the Big Lebowski Advent calendar, I might pick up one myself.
I'll let you know when they have the cigar calendar.
Well, I'd love to see the Coen brothers try something like this. So anyone else want to speak to that issue of what happens when the Christian narrative does not shape our calendars or reflects our hopes and aspirations?
Well, I'd like to talk about time. You talked about the calendar, and that connotes to me time. And as a jazz musician, as you alluded to, there was a time when we played free jazz, and we would show up with my bass and a saxophone player and a drummer, and we would pick a mode and just say, we're going to play in G minor. And we would just start playing. We wouldn't have to count off. We wouldn't have to do anything. If the time changed, if we were in 3/4 for a while, we'd play 3/4 for a while and then go to 4/4. Then to 7/4. It never mattered. We'd stretch time. And one of the things in Advent, what we've been talking about is when did time start? When are we counting from? We use thine is the kingdom and the power and glory forever. Well, when is forever? Is it forever from now forward, or is it forever now backwards? Does forever mean forever? And in that context, then we're seeing Jesus show up at a particular time, a point in time in history that wasn't a market-driven economy. There wasn't continental philosophy. There were a lot of things missing from the world that Jesus showed up. And what does that say about God? What does that say about God's timing? And that should tell us that there's something else coming that we're probably not prepared for, because God shifts. He does that shift from 3/4 to 4/4 awfully quickly and without warning and without telling us it's coming. So maybe we need to be more open and prepare our hearts more than even discussing what happened last week or the last election. All of those things are gone. Where is time? The time is gone. It's stretched. And so that's what Advent is saying to me. Stretch that time out. Let's see how elastic we can be in relationship to time.
And one of the things that you said, Jimmy, that stood out to me, the way I take it was, you know, fullness of time. Jesus came with the fullness of time. What do you mean? Our time is the fullness of time. You know, how can you ever think that it's not our time as Americans right now? This is the most pivotal time. And of course, these are weighty times. I don't want to minimize that at all. But by having this stretch time, even accounting for that first century time that it penetrates today, it can maybe help us get some perspective that God's not dead. God's very much alive and will lead us through in God's own way, in God's own stretched time, stretchable time. And let's have expectancy, not expectations that we impose on God, as Matt said earlier. And so let me transition to the fourth question. I want to ask Heather and Trudy and Matt to engage this. What specifically is your church doing to highlight this theme in its public as well as personal worship? And maybe you'd say, well, we're not doing enough. What you would like to see done, you know, or would hope to be seen as done. And then, of course, others can come in to ask, or to respond. But let's start with Heather and then Trudy and Matt, please.
Sure. I want to say one thing about what we were talking about before. I think that infusing Advent into our calendars teaches us to wait well. And Jim, when you brought up those Advent calendars, I've seen those in the stores, and part of me is like fun and horrible, because what it does is it tells me I have to have a reward for waiting. Whereas I think Advent actually can teach us to wait well, and we don't have to have the beer of the day for Advent, or right, or whatever it is. I've seen that one. Or the toy. It becomes another commercialized thing where I'm like, I have to give my kids now presents for a whole month rather than we wait for this. Okay, so our church, what we're doing, we did actually just do a podcast. I got to join my pastors and do a podcast yesterday, and we talked about Advent and talked about the tension between celebrating and anticipating and not having it become a requirement, not having it feel like a legalistic expectation, but finding joy in it. And so it was a great discussion because we got to talk about what has it looked like in some of our lives and what can it look like, and not getting too wrapped around the axle with it if you miss a day or something like that, but picking something that works for you and for your stage in life. So people who don't have children, maybe they might want to read through a devotional. People where a daily thing feels like too much, maybe they read a reading on the Sundays. For our family right now, we've got teenagers, and I light the 4 candles, and I have electric candles, so I just leave it lighting the whole time, and the battery lasts the whole time. And it's pretty low key, but it's just that reminder that in these darkest days where they're getting darker and darker, we're getting closer and closer to the light of Jesus, right? And it's that visual reminder of like, he's coming, he is coming. And when we turn on the news and we hear bad news, Jesus is coming, and building up that anticipation and that joy and that delight, trying to cultivate that. So those are some of the things we're talking quite a bit about Advent, because I think this year we need it more than ever. We need hope in the midst of it, and we need to learn to be people who can wait well and who can hang on to Jesus when there is so much uncertainty on so many levels around us.
Yeah, powerful points. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think building on what Heather was talking about, for our church, we're trying to be as family-based as possible, meaning family for the church, without meeting in person, which is, again, it is really pressing into, and our church has been quite intrigued with some of the mindset that goes into what New Wine's doing, with the idea of, when I explained to them the reason behind the name, the stretching of the wineskins, the New Wine, and they just were taken back by how we need to remind ourselves of the little details. In the Luke passage where Jesus is talking about the wineskins, he's talking about the little details of transferring from one wineskin to another so as to then be stretched and be expanded. Jesus coming into our life is the little detail of him stepping into our midst so as to stretch us. And like Heather's saying, stretch us at our, like how their church is going to meet the families, where you're out first once a month, once every week, or that's Jesus-esque, right? He steps in. And so I think for our church, that's what we're trying to do. So we put together, we have a artist in resident, and what she's done is she's gone together and put together creative ways in which you can participate either as a single, as a couple, as a family, individually or corporately. And so we have activities like that, but then we also have a gathering each week, via Zoom, to get together to talk about the advent of Jesus in our lives. Meaning, since the day that we came to recognize and realize Jesus Christ and my need for him as my savior, then what has happened since then to show this progression of his movement in my life? And what it does is then it reminds the people, when you have something as great of a gift as salvation in Jesus, you want to share it. In these worldly things that we get, if I got something as goofy as a beer advent calendar, what would I do? I would call my buddies up and say, dude, you never believe what I just got, right? I've got this. You guys in Denver, you got your pot advent calendar, and look at now, finally, in California, we have the same. They just, you can't smoke inside tobacco, but you can smoke marijuana. So we've got our advent calendar. I'd be telling them about it, right? We forget to do that with Jesus. And so what we're trying to do is reinstill within our church family this excitement, this anticipation, like, oh my gosh, this baby that we all say, no way, that does not make sense. I know. That's why when you share the story with people, you have to be intimately related to them, because for you to share the story from a distance, it sounds like you're off your rocker. This baby who comes born in a kid, like it. That's why so everything is so bound up in this intimacy and this relationality, that I think that when we get back into the excitement of the advent, the introduction of this baby king in my life, it's like, oh, wow, I've forgotten that excitement, that childlike excitement.
Well, Matt, just listening to you gets me excited for Advent. So I just wanted to thank you for that. It was pretty awesome. I mean that. It really is inspirational. And thank you too, Heather, and some great reflections there, Heather. Trudy, your thoughts on what your church is doing, or what you would hope to see done, or what you want me to do for Advent?
Well, I mentioned that for the children, they're doing daily devotions from this bag, that they get to do something every day that's a devotional for from now until Christmas. The other aspects is that we're doing this community thing towards the boxes of hope that's going to present hope, and the boxes actually say boxes of hope on them, that's going to be distributed to the at-risk families at our Title I school, and that's closest to us. And we're doing that in collaboration with another church, as well as the school, as well as another organization. And so it's kind of bringing the community together from a distance in some ways, because we're having to stage all this out so that we're not gathering in huge crowds and people are dropping things off, making desks for kids so they can study at home. And I just got word that the other church that's connecting with us, they have a warming shelter, and some individuals that are staying at that shelter have volunteered to assemble all the desks that are going to go to the students that are online studying. So, I mean, it's just so exciting to see this behind the scene expectation of collaboration, of community, but also sending that message of hope and hopefully creating trust. Because I think that's a big issue when you're talking about churches and the community at large is, do they really care, or are they really living what they are saying? And, is there an agenda to all this, other than just doing it out of the love of Christ? And I think that that's where some of that is really putting feet to the faith, to what we're doing. We're hopefully within the next week, we'll be able to do, because we're also addressing the idea that there are people that have lost people over this last year. And so, I mean, I'm in that boat. There's a tree of remembrance. And so a way that they could come in, like, and put an ornament in memory of that loved one. And, it may just be a staggered, kind of thing, but it's a way to bring healing to a very troubled year when many of these people had no services at all. The other thing we do is within the 3 campuses is that we have daily devos that are on our YouTube access every day. And so all of the staff have recorded, we've all recorded a bunch of just devotions that lead up to Advent. So we each took different ones, and they're like 3 to 5 minutes. So they're not horribly long, but just a way to have that moment in time each day to bring the elements of Advent to somebody's heart as we go forward. And then we're still trying to frame how we deal with Christmas Eve. I mean, that's just, we're not sure yet. Because all of our stuff is such a moving target, we're going to do it somehow. Obviously, if all else fails, we'll do an online version of that. But it may be a combination, but it's really making us boil down and say, how can we be intentional? But doing some of these things where some of our people are totally secluded, it gives that moment in time to remind us of the hope that we have in Jesus.
Thank you, Trudy. We're at the end of our time today, but as we close in a few minutes, I just wanted to highlight 2 aspects of what Trudy shared. Just again, that matter of constantly looking with a sense of expectancy and seeking to be creative in the moment. I mean, Jesus came into this world at a time when there was great crisis. The people of Israel were under oppression by the Roman system. Caesar Augustus had issued a tax and wanted a census for the tax. And that was all part of the oppression. And it wasn't a good time for the people. And here's Mary pregnant with Jesus, and they have to go to Bethlehem. Then later Herod finds out about it, wants him killed. I mean, these weren't great times of like exuberance. There was great lament. And that remembrance tree that Trudy talked about, remembrance, remembering people. And lament is part of the Christian story, and it's part of the biblical story. We don't have enough lament in our Christian liturgy much of the time, but it's in the Bible. It's in the Catholic Church tradition, and evangelicals can just draw from the Bible to have lament and remembrance of Christ's first coming. And also looking forward to his second coming with, as Matt said, expectancy for first and second coming. Thank you for joining us for New Wine Table Talks Live. Matt, I'm going to hand it over to you as we close off this discussion today. And thank you for the panelists, for those who are participating today with us. Be sure to contact Jim for some of his specials on Advent calendars. And then Matt, just close us off, would you please?
Yeah. And thank you again to everyone joining us on Facebook Live. Remember, every week we do this 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time where we come together to discuss the things that the Lord is doing, not only in the life of New Wine, but in the life of the members and the leaders of our communities. And so thank you for joining us again today. Next week, we'll be doing the same time, 1 p.m. We'll be getting together, talking about the spiritual calendar again. As I said in the beginning, if you hit like right now on our Facebook page, then it'll inform you. So you'll get the notification, you'll get the reminder when we send out the tweet saying, hey, we're going live. So we're also on Twitter as well, NWNWS, New Wine Skins. And so we also have Instagram. So if you get on our Facebook page, you'll find out where all of these, you can join us and join the New Wine Skins movement, where we're seeking to build relational bridges in contemporary culture through Jesus Christ. So on behalf of the panelists today, thank you so very much for joining us. If you ever want more information about New Wine, please feel free to put in the comments in our Facebook page or put it up on a post, a direct message. One of us will get back to you, or go to our website page, new-wineskins.org, and get on there and see. You can join our newsletter and get informed by that. And then you can also check out some of the other things that we have going on with our academic journal, Cultural Encounters, as well as the happenings and events. Our documentary that Dr. Metzger talked about, that was From Isolation to Inclusion, a documentary on disabilities, which will then inform you about the things that New Wine has going on. So that, like, come February, we're doing a conference on mental health. and you'll be apprised of that and given the details of that. So things that are coming up for the future, because New Wine, again, it's a constant pursuit of the one who has pursued us in love. As we draw near to God, we recognize that he first drew near to us so as to envelop us in this divine love. So on behalf of everyone here on New Wine Table Talks, I'm Matt Farlow. We'll see you next week. We'll see you on the flip side. Have a good one.